Mackie thinks that ordinary moral judgments, like you ought not to stab your TA or you ought to save the drowning child, include a claim to objectivity. To see what he means by that, imagine passing the drowning child in the pond and wondering whether it would be wrong for you to pass the child by and go off to your important business meeting. Let me adapt a quotation from Mackie on page 853 of the Norton Anthology to the pond case. So you're in a state of moral perplexity, and you want to arrive at some judgment about this concrete case. You're saving the child at this time in these actual circumstances. So imagine you're thinking about whether to save the child. The question is not, for example, whether you really want to save the child, whether it will satisfy or dissatisfy you, whether you will in the long run have a pro attitude towards it, regard it favourably in some way, or even whether this is an action of a sort that you can happily and sincerely recommend in all relevantly similar cases. Nor are you wondering just whether to recommend such an action in all relevantly similar cases. Nor are you wondering whether society as a whole is going to approve of your action. No, you just want to know whether this course of action would be wrong in itself. And the question of whether it's wrong in itself to ignore the child and go on to your business meeting has got nothing to do with how you personally feel about it, or how your friends feel about it, or how society in general regards it. That's what Mackie means by objectivity. Consider two kinds of ought claims. Here's one, a conditional ought claim. If you want to get to Logan Airport, you ought to take the Silver Line from South Station. And here's an unconditional or categorical ought claim. You ought not to stab your TA. Categorical should remind you of Kant's categorical imperative, a rule that's supposedly binding on all rational agents. Now, why is the conditional claim true? Roughly speaking, what in the world makes that conditional claim true? Suppose it is true. Well, it's something like this. The conditional claim is true because taking the Silver Line is the best way, it's the quickest, the cheapest, the most convenient way to get to Logan. That's the thing in the world that makes that claim true. And because there doesn't seem to be anything particularly puzzling about the fact that the Silver Line is the cheapest way to get to Logan, or the quickest way, the conditional claim seems quite unpuzzling. But what about the unconditional claim? You ought not to stab your TA. This is supposed to be true no matter what your goals or objectives are. Even if stabbing your TA would fulfill your lifelong ambition for national infamy, and you'd certainly make newspaper headlines if you did it, or even if it would be approved of in your society, you still ought not to do it. Whether people would approve of your stabbing your TA is irrelevant to whether you ought or ought not to do it. So what in the world, to borrow a phrase from Mackie, makes this puzzling ought claim true? If you want to get to the airport, you ought to take the Silver Line. Seems not very puzzling. But the unconditional categorical, you ought to stab your TA, does seem very mysterious. Here's another way of bringing out the puzzling character of moral claims, like you ought to save the drowning child, or you ought not to stab your TA. Here's Mackie on page 856, the Norton Anthology. An objective good would be sought by anyone who was acquainted with it, not because of any contingent fact that this person or every person was so constituted that he desires this end, but just because the end has to-be-pursuedness somehow built into it. Similarly, if there were objective principles of right and wrong, any wrong possible course of action would have not-to-be-doneness somehow built into it. According to Mackie, when we say you ought not to stab your TA, what we're basically saying is the course of action, stabbing your TA, has not-to-be-doneness somehow built into it, independently of what our attitudes may be towards that action. Similarly, when we say that you ought to save the child, the drowning child, what we're saying, in effect, is the action of saving the drowning child has to-be-doneness somehow built into it. That action is to be done no matter whether you want to or not, no matter whether you approve of it or not, no matter whether your society approves of it or not. Here's an analogy which might be helpful. This is Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. We've already met Lewis Carroll when we did some elementary logic early on. If you've read Alice, then you may remember that when Alice falls down the rabbit hole, soon her eye fell on a little glass box that was lying under the table. She opened it and found in it a very small cake on which the words "Eat me" were beautifully marked in currants. Cakes, of course, are delicious and people want to eat them. Do cakes have to-be-eatenness somehow built into them, irrespective of people's taste buds, desires, state of hunger, and so forth? No, of course not. Cakes are to be eaten by some people on some occasions, but this is not solely due to the cake. It's significantly due to the people themselves. There's no such thing as objective to-be-eatenness, independently of how hungry people are or what their tastes and preferences are. So there's no such thing as objective to-be-eatenness in the world. The world just isn't like that. Similarly, Mackie thinks, for objective values. We think there are such things, but in fact, we're wrong.